The night descended over Brooklyn like a heavy curtain, thick with fog and the scent of rain-soaked earth. The old St. Joseph Cemetery sat on the edge of the city, forgotten by most, visited by few. Its iron gates creaked in the wind, and the ancient tombstones leaned at crooked angles, their inscriptions worn away by decades of weather and neglect. This was a place where the dead rested undisturbed, where the living rarely ventured after dark. But Don Emilio Santoro was not like most of the living. He arrived just before midnight, his black sedan rolling silently through the narrow cemetery roads, headlights cutting through the mist. The driver stopped at a familiar spot, and Emilio stepped out, his expensive Italian shoes crunching softly on the gravel path. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver streaking through his dark hair. His face was carved from stone, hard, expressionless, the face of a man who had built an empire on fear and blood. In his hand, he carried a single bouquet of white lilies. He walked alone, as he always did on this night. His men knew better than to follow. This was a ritual he performed once a year, always on the same date, always at the same grave. It was not out of guilt or remorse. Emilio Santoro did not believe in such weaknesses. It was simply a marker, a way of acknowledging the moment when everything had changed, when he had crossed the line from soldier to king. The grave was tucked away in a quiet corner, beneath the shadow of a sprawling oak tree. The headstone was modest, unadorned, with only a name and 2 dates carved into the granite. Marco Rinaldi, 1978-2008. No epitaph, no farewell, just a name and the years that framed a life cut short. Emilio knelt and placed the lilies at the base of the stone. The wind whispered through the branches above, and for a moment, the only sound was the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city beyond the cemetery walls. He stayed there for a few minutes, his expression unreadable, his thoughts locked away behind walls built over decades. Then he saw it, a shape, small and dark, lying beside the grave. At first he thought it was a bundle of clothes or perhaps a bag left behind by a careless visitor. But as he stepped closer, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, he realized it was a child, a boy, no older than 10, curled up on the cold ground beside Marco Rinaldi's tombstone. He was wrapped in a thin, threadbare blanket, his small body trembling from the cold. His hair was dark and matted, his clothes worn and dirty, and his face, pale and gaunt, was pressed against the earth as if seeking warmth from the grave itself. Emilio's heart, hardened by years of violence and betrayal, stuttered in his chest. He stood frozen, staring at the boy, his mind racing. What was a child doing here, alone, in the middle of the night, sleeping beside a grave? There were no flowers, no candles, no signs that anyone else had been here recently. Just the boy, alone, clinging to the memory of the dead. Emilio's instinct was to leave. This was not his problem. He had enough burdens, enough ghosts haunting him, but something held him in place. Perhaps it was the way the boy's hand clutched something against his chest, or perhaps it was the faint rise and fall of his breathing, so fragile, so vulnerable. He knelt down, closer this time, and gently shook the boy's shoulder. The child stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They were dark, like his father's had been, and filled with a confusion that quickly turned to fear. He sat up abruptly, pulling the blanket tighter around himself, his body tense, ready to run. Emilio raised his hands slowly, a gesture of peace. He said nothing at first, simply watching the boy, noting the way his gaze darted between Emilio and the grave, as if seeking reassurance from the stone itself. Then the boy's hand opened, revealing what he had been clutching, a small silver locket, tarnished and worn. It hung from a broken chain, and inside, Emilio could just make out the edge of a photograph. The boy's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the silence like a blade. "This is my dad's grave. I sleep here so he's not alone." Emilio felt something crack inside him, something he thought had died long ago. He stared at the locket, then at the name on the tombstone, and the pieces began to fall into place. Marco Rinaldi, the man he had killed 17 years ago. The man whose death had paved Emilio's path to power. And now, here was his son, alone and abandoned, sleeping beside a grave because he had nowhere else to go. For the first time in decades, Emilio Santoro did not know what to do. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Past. Emilio's mind raced as he stared at the boy. Memories he had buried deep began to surface, unwanted and sharp. He remembered that night 17 years ago, the night everything had changed. Marco Rinaldi had been a rival, a rising power in the criminal underworld, a man who had refused to bow to the old order. Emilio had been ordered to eliminate him, to send a message that disloyalty would not be tolerated. He remembered the warehouse on the waterfront, the cold metal of the gun in his hand, the look of defiance in Marco's eyes even as he faced his death. Marco had not begged. He had not pleaded. He had simply stood there, accepting his fate, his last words, a quiet promise that someday the truth would come out. Emilio had pulled the trigger without hesitation. It was business, nothing personal. Marco's death had opened doors for Emilio, had elevated him from a soldier to a leader, had given him the empire he ruled today. But Marco had not been just a criminal, he had been a father. Emilio looked at the boy again, taking in the hollow cheeks, the torn jacket, the dirt under his fingernails. How long had he been living like this? How long had he been sleeping beside his father's grave, clinging to the memory of a man who could never return? The boy stared back at him, wary, but not hostile. There was a quiet strength in his gaze, a resilience that reminded Emilio of Marco himself. This child had survived something, grief, poverty, abandonment, and yet here he was, still fighting, still refusing to give up. Emilio made a decision. He stood and extended his hand to the boy. "Come with me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You can't stay here. It's too cold." The boy hesitated, his eyes flickering between Emilio and the grave. For a moment Emilio thought he would refuse, that he would cling to the only thing he had left. But then, slowly, the boy reached out and took Emilio's hand. His grip was small and cold, but it held on tight. Emilio led him back to the sedan, the boy following silently, clutching the locket against his chest. The driver said nothing, simply opened the door and waited. Emilio helped the boy into the back seat, then climbed in beside him. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Emilio glanced back at Marco Rinaldi's grave, the white lilies glowing faintly in the moonlight. The weight of what he had done settled over him like a shroud, heavier than it had ever been before. The drive back to Emilio's estate was silent. The boy sat stiffly beside him, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings, the leather seats, the polished interior, the quiet hum of the engine. He clutched his locket tightly, as if afraid it might disappear. Emilio's home was a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and guarded gates. It was a fortress, a symbol of his power and control. But tonight, as they passed through the gates, it felt more like a prison. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Emilio led the boy to the kitchen, where he instructed the housekeeper to prepare food. The woman, an older Italian lady who had worked for Emilio for years, asked no questions. She simply nodded and set to work, heating soup and slicing bread. The boy ate slowly, his hands trembling as he lifted the spoon to his mouth. He had not eaten a proper meal in days, perhaps weeks. Emilio watched him in silence, his mind churning with questions he did not yet know how to ask. When the boy finished, Emilio spoke. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, his dark eyes meeting Emilio's. "Daniel," he said quietly. Daniel Rinaldi. The name hit Emilio like a punch to the gut. Rinaldi, the name of the man he had killed. The name that would forever tie him to this child. Emilio nodded slowly. "Where's your mother, Daniel?" The boy's expression darkened. "She's gone. She left after my dad died. I don't know where she is." Emilio's jaw tightened. So the boy had been abandoned twice, first by death, then by neglect. He'd been left to fend for himself, to survive on the streets, to sleep beside a grave because he had nowhere else to go. Emilio stood and gestured for Daniel to follow. He led the boy upstairs to one of the guest rooms, a spacious bedroom with a large bed and a window overlooking the grounds. "You'll stay here tonight," Emilio said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do." Daniel nodded, his eyes already heavy with exhaustion. He climbed into the bed, still clutching the locket, and pulled the covers up to his chin. Emilio stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the boy's breathing slow as sleep overtook him. Then he turned and walked away, the weight of his past heavier than ever. Chapter 3. The Unspoken Truth. The days that followed were unlike anything Emilio had experienced in decades. Daniel stayed in the mansion, quiet and cautious, moving through the rooms like a ghost. He spoke little, answered questions with short, careful responses, and spent much of his time staring out the window or clutching the locket that held his father's photograph. Emilio watched him, unsure of what to do. He had built his life on control, on knowing how to navigate every situation, but this was different. He could not simply order Daniel to trust him, could not buy his way out of the guilt that gnawed at him every time he looked at the boy's face. Daniel was polite but distant. He accepted the food, the clean clothes, the warm bed, but he did not smile. He did not ask questions. He simply existed, waiting for something Emilio could not name. Emilio made discreet inquiries, using his network to search for Daniel's mother. What he found only deepened his unease. She had left the city shortly after Marco's death, spiraling into addiction and instability. She had abandoned Daniel when he was just 8 years old, leaving him in the care of an elderly aunt who had since passed away. The boy had been on his own for nearly 2 years, surviving on the streets, sleeping in shelters, or when he could, beside his father's grave. The more Emilio learned, the more the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had not just killed Marco Rinaldi, he had destroyed a family. He had taken a father from a son, had set in motion a chain of events that had left this boy alone and broken. And now Daniel was here, in his home, under his protection, unaware that the man feeding him, sheltering him, was the same man who had pulled the trigger all those years ago. One evening, as Emilio sat in his study, Daniel appeared in the doorway. He stood there, small and uncertain, holding the locket in his hand. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said quietly. Emilio nodded, setting down his glass of whiskey. "Of course. Why did you help me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unanswerable. Emilio stared at the boy, searching for words that would not be a lie, but would not reveal the truth. "Because no child should have to sleep beside a grave," he said finally. Daniel looked down at the locket, his thumb tracing the outline of the photograph inside. "My dad was a good man," he said softly. "Everyone says he wasn't, but he was. He always told me to be strong, to take care of myself. I try, but it's hard." Emilio's throat tightened. "You're stronger than you know, Daniel." The boy looked up, and for the first time, there was something other than wariness in his eyes, a flicker of trust, fragile and tentative. "Thank you," Daniel whispered. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Emilio alone with the ghosts of his past. That night, Emilio could not sleep. He stood by the window, staring out at the city lights, his mind replaying every moment of the night he had killed Marco Rinaldi. He saw Marco's face, heard his final words, felt the recoil of the gun in his hand, And now he saw Daniel, curled up beside a grave, clinging to the memory of a father who would never return. Emilio had built his empire on violence and power, but for the first time, he questioned whether it had been worth it. He had taken lives, destroyed families, ruled with fear. And for what? A mansion he barely lived in. A name that inspired terror, but no respect. He thought of Daniel, sleeping in the room down the hall, and realized that he had been given a chance, not for redemption, but for something more. A chance to do one thing right, to protect the son of the man he had destroyed. But he could never tell Daniel the truth. That burden was his alone to carry. Chapter 4. A promise kept in shadows. The weeks turned into months, and Daniel slowly began to change. The hollow look in his eyes faded, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He started to smile just a little when the housekeeper made his favorite meals. He began to explore the grounds, to ask questions about the books in Emilio's study, to sit quietly beside him in the evenings. Emilio, too, changed. He found himself thinking less about business and more about the boy. He made sure Daniel had everything he needed: new clothes, books, a tutor to help him catch up on the schooling he had missed. He watched Daniel grow stronger, healthier, more alive, and felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It was not redemption. Emilio knew he could never undo what he had done. But perhaps, in protecting Daniel, in giving him a chance at a life his father had been denied, he could balance some small part of the scales. But the truth was a shadow that followed him everywhere. Every time Daniel smiled, every time he called Emilio sir with that quiet respect, Emilio felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him. He knew that if Daniel ever learned the truth, everything would shatter. The fragile trust they had built would crumble, and the boy would be alone again. Emilio made a decision. He would ensure Daniel's future, would give him every opportunity, but he would do so from the shadows. He would never claim credit, never reveal who he truly was. He would be the silent guardian, the invisible hand that kept Daniel safe. And so, on a cold November morning, Emilio made the arrangements. He transferred ownership of a small apartment in a safe neighborhood to Daniel's name. He set up a trust fund that would cover his education, his living expenses, his future. He found a kind, trustworthy family who agreed to take Daniel in, to give him the stability and love he deserved. When the day came for Daniel to leave, Emilio stood in the doorway, watching as the boy packed his few belongings. Daniel turned to him, his expression a mix of gratitude and confusion. "You're not coming with me?" Daniel asked. Emilio shook his head. "I have things I need to take care of, but you'll be safe. You'll have everything you need." Daniel stepped forward and, to Emilio's surprise, hugged him. It was brief, awkward, but genuine. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, "for everything." Emilio's throat tightened, and he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Be strong, Daniel. Live the life your father would have wanted for you." Daniel nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and then he was gone. Emilio stood alone in the empty mansion, the silence pressing down on him. He walked to his study, poured himself a drink, and stared at the photograph on his desk. A picture of Marco Rinaldi taken from the police file years ago. "I took your life," Emilio whispered to the photograph, "but I'll give him mine." And he meant it. Over the years that followed, no one saw Don Emilio Santoro anymore. He disappeared from the criminal world, his empire dissolving as rivals moved in to fill the void. Some said he had been killed, others that he had fled the country. But the truth was simpler and more profound. He had stepped back into the shadows, watching Daniel from a distance. He ensured the boy's safety, quietly intervening when threats arose, making sure he never knew who was protecting him. He watched Daniel graduate from high school, then college. He watched him build a life, find happiness, become the man his father had hoped he would be. and on quiet nights, Emilio would return to the cemetery, to the grave of Marco Rinaldi, and place a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone. He would kneel there, in the darkness, and whisper apologies to a ghost who could never hear him, because some debts could never be repaid. Some sins could never be forgiven. But perhaps, in the life of a boy who had once slept beside a grave, there was a small measure of grace. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, emotional tales that will stay with you long after the final word. Hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey through stories of redemption, sacrifice, and the human heart. 20 years had passed since that cold November night when Daniel Rinaldi left Emilio Santoro's mansion, carrying nothing but a small bag of belongings and a silver locket containing his father's photograph. 2 decades of life had unfolded, each year taking him further from the frightened boy who had once slept beside a grave and closer to the man he was meant to become. Daniel had graduated from Columbia University with honors, earning a degree in social work. The irony was not lost on him. The boy who had once been homeless, abandoned and forgotten had dedicated his life to helping others who found themselves in similar circumstances. He worked for a non-profit organization in Manhattan, providing support and resources to at-risk youth, children who had fallen through the cracks of society just as he once had. He had married a kind woman named Sarah, a teacher with warm eyes and a gentle spirit who reminded him that goodness still existed in the world. They had 2 children, a daughter named Elena and a son named Marco, after the father Daniel had never stopped loving. They lived in a modest but comfortable home in Queens, filled with laughter and light, the kind of home Daniel had dreamed of as a child, but never thought he would have. Life had been good to Daniel Rinaldi, but there was always a shadow at the edge of his happiness, a question that had haunted him for 20 years. Who had saved him that night? Who had taken him in, provided for him, and then disappeared without explanation? He remembered the man with silver-streaked hair and stone-carved features, the man who had found him beside his father's grave and changed the course of his life. Daniel had tried to find him over the years, had searched records and made inquiries, but it was as if the man had never existed. The apartment Daniel had lived in, the trust fund that had paid for his education, all of it had been arranged through anonymous lawyers and shell corporations that led nowhere. It was a mystery that both comforted and troubled him. Someone had cared enough to save him, to give him a future, but had not wanted recognition or gratitude in return. It was an act of pure, selfless generosity, and Daniel had spent his adult life trying to honor it by passing that kindness forward. But tonight, on the anniversary of his father's death, Daniel found himself driving back to Brooklyn, back to the old St. Joseph Cemetery where everything had begun. It had become his own ritual, visiting the grave once a year, bringing flowers, telling his father about his life, his family, his work. He brought his children sometimes, wanting them to know the grandfather they would never meet, to understand that even in darkness there could be light. The cemetery had not changed much. The iron gate still creaked, the tombstones still leaned at awkward angles, and the old oak tree still stood watch over his father's grave. Daniel parked his car and walked the familiar path, carrying a bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers that had always appeared on his father's grave during those early years, placed by an unknown hand. As he approached the grave, he noticed something unusual. There was already a bouquet of white lilies resting against the headstone, fresh and carefully arranged. Daniel's heart quickened. In all the years he had been coming here, he had never encountered another visitor. He had assumed he was alone in remembering Marco Rinaldi. He knelt beside the grave and placed his own flowers next to the others. The night was quiet, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Daniel closed his eyes and spoke softly to the stone, as he always did. "Hi, Dad. It's me again. The kids are doing great. Elena wants to be a doctor. And Marco, well, Marco wants to be a superhero, but he's only 6, so we'll see how that goes." He smiled, feeling the familiar ache in his chest. "I wish you could have met them. I wish you could have seen the life I built. I think you'd be proud." A voice spoke from behind him, rough and weathered, but still strong. "He would be. More than you know." Daniel's heart stopped. He turned slowly, and there, standing in the shadows beneath the oak tree, was a man he had not seen in 20 years. The silver in his hair had turned to white, and the lines on his face had deepened. But the eyes, those dark, penetrating eyes, were unmistakable. "You," Daniel whispered, rising to his feet, "you're the one who saved me." Emilio Santoro stepped forward into the moonlight, his expression unreadable. He looked older, thinner, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him, but there was something different in his bearing, something softer, more human. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Emilio said quietly. "I thought it would be better if I stayed away." Daniel stared at him, 1,000 questions flooding his mind. "Why? Why did you help me? And why did you disappear?" Emilio was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the grave between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a burden Daniel could not yet understand. "Because I owed your father a debt I could never repay." Daniel frowned, confusion washing over him. "You knew my father?" Emilio nodded slowly. "I did, a long time ago." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father was a good man, Daniel, better than most of us. He was caught up in a world that destroyed good men, a world of violence and power and betrayal. And I—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I was part of that world." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. A cold realization began to dawn on him, pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed suddenly falling into place. "What are you saying?" Emilio met his gaze, and in his eyes Daniel saw something he had never expected. Guilt, deep and profound, the kind that could never be washed away. "Your father died because of the world he was in, and I was the one who pulled the trigger." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Daniel staggered back, his mind reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. The man who had saved him, who had given him a life, who had protected him from the shadows, was the same man who had killed his father. "No," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's not possible. You helped me. I took everything from you," Emilio interrupted, his voice breaking. "Your father, your family, your childhood. I destroyed your life before it even began. And when I found you that night sleeping beside his grave, I realized what I had done, not just to him, but to you. I couldn't bring him back, but I could give you a chance. I could make sure you didn't end up like me." Daniel's hands trembled, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Rage and grief and confusion warred within him, tearing him apart. "You killed my father," he said, his voice shaking, "and then you pretended to be my savior." "I never pretended to be anything," Emilio said quietly. "I just tried to do one thing right, one thing to balance the scales, even though I knew it never could." Daniel turned away, his hands covering his face, tears streaming down his cheeks. He thought of all the years he had wondered about the man who saved him, had imagined him as some kind of guardian angel, and now he knew the truth. His guardian angel was the devil who had destroyed his family. But even as the rage burned in his chest, another part of him, a quieter, more painful part, remembered the kindness. The warm meals, the safe bed, the education, the future, the life he had built, the family he had created, the children who called him Dad. None of it would have existed without the man standing before him. "Why are you telling me this now?" Daniel asked, his voice raw. "Because I'm dying," Emilio said simply. Cancer. The doctors give me a few months, maybe less, and I couldn't go without you knowing the truth. You deserved that much. Daniel turned back to face him, his eyes red and swollen. What do you want from me? Forgiveness. Emilio shook his head. No, I don't deserve forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that your father was a good man, that he loved you, and that everything I did, it wasn't to ease my conscience. It was because when I looked at you, I saw what my choices had cost, and I couldn't let you pay for my sins anymore. The two men stood in silence, the grave of Marco Rinaldi between them, a monument to all that had been lost and all that had been saved. Daniel looked down at the locket he still wore around his neck, the photograph of his father faded but still visible. I don't know if I can forgive you, Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I ever will. I know, Emilio replied, and I don't expect you to. I just wanted you to know the truth. Emilio turned to leave, his footsteps slow and heavy. But before he disappeared into the darkness, Daniel called out to him. Wait! Emilio stopped, looking back over his shoulder. Daniel took a deep breath, his heart aching with the weight of all he had learned. My son, Marco, he's named after my father, and my daughter, Elena. She's kind and brave, just like her grandfather would have been. He paused, his voice breaking. They exist because you gave me a chance, and I hate you for what you did, but I also... He couldn't finish the sentence. Emilio nodded, understanding what Daniel could not say. Live well, Daniel. Be the father your children need. Be the man your father wanted you to be. That's all I ask. And with that, Emilio Santoro walked away, disappearing into the shadows one final time. Daniel stood alone beside his father's grave, the two bouquets of white lilies glowing in the moonlight. He thought of his father, of the man who had killed him, of the life that had been built on such a tragic foundation, and he realized that the world was not made of heroes and villains, but of broken people trying to find their way through the darkness. He knelt once more, touching the cold stone of his father's grave. I'll keep your memory alive, Dad, he whispered, and I'll make sure your grandson knows what kind of man you were. As Daniel drove home that night, back to his wife and children, he carried with him the weight of the truth. It would take time to process, and time to understand, time to decide what to do with this knowledge. But for now he held on to the one thing that mattered most. The life he had been given, the family he had built, the love that had survived even the darkest of sins. And somewhere in the city, in a small empty apartment, Emilio Santoro sat alone, the photograph of Marco Rinaldi in his hands, waiting for the end that would finally bring him peace. Some debts could never be repaid, some sins could never be forgiven. But perhaps, in the life of a boy who had once slept beside a grave and grown into a man who helped others, there was a measure of grace after all. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that explore the depths of the human experience. Your support means everything. Until next time.